One of the most notorious and brutal kings to ever have ruled over England was King Henry VIII, who is best known for the fact he had 6 wives. 2 of his wives lost their heads inside of the Tower of London, as a skilled swordsman and an axeman would perform the terrible jobs of taking the heads off the queens and his wives. However, in his latter years, Henry VIII put on a huge amount of weight, and he was a shadow of his former self, and following a severe injury on the tilt yard, the king became rather immobile, and he found himself pushed around in a wheelchair, and even at times unable to get out of bed. The king had been in his 30s, smashed off his horse, and then following this he was knocked out for hours, and Henry VIII then became more tyrannical, and he suffered from sharp mood swings that led to his short temper. But Henry VIII would then sentence to death some of his closest friends, including Thomas Cromwell, but at the start of 1547, Henry VIII was on his deathbed, and he would succumb to his poor health. Then following his death he would be buried inside of a burial vault, which he would not have been happy with. Henry VIII did not want to remain 500 years later in a burial vault with no pomp and ceremony, but throughout the centuries his burial vault would be opened a number of times. Join us today as we look at opening the burial vault of King Henry VIII, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 29th of January 1547, King Henry VIII died, and his death was one which was not in keeping with the chaotic life he was known for. The king slipped away peacefully, and he was attended on by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Henry's close friend, who promised the king he would go to heaven. Henry VIII on his deathbed would admit that he made a lot of mistakes throughout his reign, that he sinned a lot, and he believed this would prevent him from getting into heaven following his death. But after the king died, Edward VI, Henry's son, would be made king, and pronounced king a few days later. However, Henry VIII's body was embalmed, and a large cut was made into his chest, and his heart and vital organs were removed, and these were then put inside of lead caskets or boxes, and were buried away from his body, as was tradition. This happened with Henry's 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, whose heart was buried under the altar of Hampton Court Palace, where she gave birth to the heir and successor, and also where she died following giving birth. But Jane would be buried alongside her husband, and Henry VIII insisted that he should be laid to rest alongside his 3rd wife, who gave him everything he wanted. Following the embalming process, Henry's body was placed in a lead-lined coffin, and it was then laid in state in the presence chamber of Whitehall Palace for some time, and it was surrounded by burning tapers before the funeral procession began. Henry would be buried inside of Windsor Castle, and the church inside of this castle, St George's Chapel. The king decided he wanted to be placed in the same vault as Jane, but he would never have imagined that today he is still laid to rest beneath a simple marble slab with no pomp or ceremony, and the king even stipulated that an ornate and grand tomb he had planned would one day be his final resting place. Henry would have liked to have been held in this, which would have been placed near to his mother and father's tomb in the heart of Westminster Abbey, in the Henry VII Lady Chapel. This tomb for Henry had been planned for many decades, and he wanted the huge ornamental tomb to be grander and larger than his mother and father's tomb. It was planned to be 25% bigger, and Italian sculptors began to work on this, and Henry even argued with them at times over the design. But the king's children and later heirs, including his daughters Mary I and Elizabeth I, would not complete the tomb, as it would be too costly, and the dream Henry had of being laid in grand tombs and a spectacle would not occur. The coffin of Henry VIII following his death began the procession from Whitehall Palace to Windsor Castle. The procession in total was 4 miles long, and the roads of Windsor had to even be widened to allow the procession to pass by, and the hearse containing the king's coffin was being pulled by horses which had been covered in black cloth. The coffin was grand, and on top was a large effigy of Henry VIII, which was adorned with his jewels and clothes, and for those who saw the procession, it was an incredible thing to see. But it was also for most the first time they had ever seen an image of the man who for decades had ruled over them. The funeral procession then moved towards Sion Abbey, and it would then for the evening rest up, and the coffin was then laid to rest in the abbey. There has been speculation that during this rest stop that the king's remains may have exploded due to gases building up inside of his body, and some stories say that this dripped out of the bottom of the coffin, then this was licked at by dogs. But then the next day the procession continued to Windsor, and when it arrived at St George's Chapel, 16 strong yeomen of the guard carried the heavy coffin of Henry VIII into the church. The funeral service then took place, and following this the coffin was lowered into the vault, where Jane Seymour was also buried, and today the coffin of the king still remains here 500 years on. Henry's officers of his household and his servants broke their ceremonial staves of office, and they threw these inside of the vault to symbolise the end of their work being done. But as mentioned today, Henry is buried under a marble slab that has no image of him, and it simply says, "In a vault beneath this marble slab are deposited the remains of Jane Seymour, Queen of King Henry VIII, 1537, King Henry VIII, 1547, King Charles I, 1648, and an infant child of Queen Anne. This memorial was placed here by the command of King William IV, 1837. But the remains and coffin of King Henry VIII was disturbed a number of times, and his burial vault would be opened on numerous occasions. He would even be buried next to one of his greatest enemies. The most profound and important person buried inside of the vault, behind Henry VIII, is King Charles I. Charles would be the king who lost his head following the English Civil War, and he was remembered as a rather poor king. Following the king's execution, Parliament were concerned as to what to do with Charles's remains, but because of this they believed that Charles should be buried in secret in a quiet part of London, and they settled on the same burial vault as King Henry VIII. But when it came to bury King Charles, it's believed that some damage did occur to Henry's coffin at the time, as they squeezed Charles's coffin into the small vault. The workers had to move Henry's coffin to the side, and they may have damaged some of the wood in doing this. But a Stuart being buried next to a Tudor king, who barred the Stuarts from the throne, would be considered shocking, as Henry VIII hated the Stuart royal family. But in 1813 the vault would be broken into yet again, and building work was occurring inside of St George's Chapel and the royal vault. Builders entered Henry VIII's vault, and some officials even opened the coffin of King Charles I to confirm it was his remains there, and the future King George IV even witnessed this. But they then noticed that Henry VIII's coffin was in a bad way, and it had been broken, and the trestle that it was sat upon was broken, and this collapsed when Charles's coffin was placed inside. The pressure from within the coffin may have also damaged the wood and splintered it, and the top of the coffin may have been even split open. But King Henry VIII was the most notorious and shocking king that England has ever had, but he was buried in a quiet and small vault, and very little would mark the remains of England's most famous king. Henry VIII was not buried in the grand tomb that he wanted, and it's arguable that he deserves to be buried in a grander and larger monument. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.